When Hollywood's toughest guy sits bottomward for a affable morning actualization interview, Cypher expects Blaze to fly. But a back George Stephanopoulos decides to blow the bear. Alike Mark Wahlberg's allegorical patience has its limits. A simple promo actualization for his new cine turns into one of live television's best afflictive and acclaimed showdowns. This is the adventure of how one catechism to abounding pushed Mark Wahlberg out of his armchair and off the set. The Good Morning America flat bustled, as usual. Bright lights aflame off able floors, producers whispering after most minute instructions into earpieces. It was a arbiter morning for George Stephanopoulos and his aggregation until Mark Wahlberg absolved to simulate the set. Dressed articulate in a fleet clothing and tie, Wahlberg looked every bit the cine brilliant as he befuddled easily with Stephanopoulos and acclimatized into his chair. He was there to advance his newest movie, an activity abstruseness that critics were already calling an acknowledgement to anatomy for the actor. Good morning, Mark. Acknowledgement for actuality here, George began, a flame that seasoned, hardly apposite smile of his, always a pleasure, George. Happy to allocution about the film, Wahlberg replied with a assured grin, adjusting his cufflinks the aboriginal few account of the account when as expected. Wahlberg talked about his alertness for the role, the arduous concrete training, and how abundant he'd enjoyed alive with his co-stars. Clips from the cine flashed on the monitors abaft them, showcasing Mark's signature alloy of boxy guy dust and affecting depth, but a fresh George leaned advanced slightly, ambiguity his cue cards, and the affection began to shift. Mark, he began, smoothly you've played this affectionate of role, a accustomed hero, angry adjoin the allowance, abounding times. Some abilities say you've been arena, the aforementioned appearance for over a decade now. Do you any time anguish that you're tipcasting yourself? The catechism drew a abreast babble from the crew. Wahlberg blinked, afresh chuckled softly, admitting his eyes accustomed aloof a touch. I anticipate every role I booty brings article. New, he replied evenly. Sure, there are capacity I approach toward. Honor, redemption. But I try to accomplish anniversary appearance altered and audiences assume to acknowledge that. George nodded thoughtfully, but apprenticed on, but you don't anticipate maybe Hollywood has confused on your after most few films haven't absolutely set the box appointment on fire. Some critics accept said your assignment afresh feels well, dated. How do you acknowledge to that this time? Wahlberg's jaw anchored noticeably. He confused hardly in his chair, the smile fading, while he began carefully. Look, not every cine is activity to be a billion-dollar franchise, but I'm appreciative of my work. I've never been abashed of demography risks, alike if the allotment aren't consistently huge. Not everything's about numbers, George. There was a beam of article in George's expression, a beam, perhaps, that Wahlberg seemed to catch. I accept what you're saying, George said, aptitude aback slightly. But some would altercate that demography, these smaller, beneath impactful roles, is a way to break a cordon apac you're no best at the top of your game. Do you any time admiration, if your time as a archman is abaft you? That catechism landed. Like a punch, Wahlberg's aperture apprenticed into a tenuate line. His acknowledgement was abstinent but sharp. George, he said flatly, if you anticipate I've absent a step, maybe you should appear alternation with me for a day. I don't anticipate you'd accumulate up. The admirers gave a abashed laugh, but George didn't absence a beat. Oh, I don't. Agnosticism your fitness. Mark, he said lightly, but this isn't about gym routines. This is about whether the industry still sees you as a draw. Wahlberg's eyes narrowed aloof slightly, but he captivated his tongue. Allotment instead to accord George a faint, humorless smile. Well, the bodies who appoint me still assume to anticipate I accept article to offer, he said finally. And added importantly, so do audiences. George nodded again, his announcement thoughtful, but his abutting words hinted that this was far from over. That may be, George said slowly, Borer, his basis agenda adjoined the desk. But some of your Ian and critics accept started analytic. Whether your application roles that could go to younger, fresher talent, that all the money and accolades you've becoming ability absolutely be captivation, others back. How do you acknowledge to that? Wahlberg froze for bisected a beat, the catechism acutely landing harder than he'd anticipated. Aback, he did respond. His articulation was still calm, but his Boston bend was starting to show. I don't anticipate anyone should apologize for success, George, and I don't anticipate dispatch abreast aloof, because addition abroad wants what you accept is the appropriate acknowledgement either. I become an aggregate I've got, and Cypher handed me abuse thing. For the aboriginal, time aback, the account began, the atmosphere, angry, absolutely tense. Alike the camera operators seemed to hesitate, casual at anniversary, added as the two men bound eyes. And aloof like that, anybody watching knew this was no best about a cine promo. This was about pride. This was about two men with actual altered definitions of success, and neither accommodating to a back bottom or to back you, a back a man into A corner, alike the comst, can about face fierce, and on a live television, that bend came fast. Admirers had acquainted in for a controllable promo. What they got instead was a apathetic motion, alternation, bones they couldn't attending abroad from the camera red ablaze, glowed hot as George adapted his notes, his able smile abrasion anytime so slightly. Mark sat adamant now, his duke whitening, a joint his knee beneath the desk. So George began again, his emphasis deceptively light. You've been authoritative movies, a connected time now, but let's be honest, you're after most few haven't absolutely burst box appointment records, except they do you anytime anguish, you're aloof cashing in on your name. At this point, a babble went through the flat audience. Mark's jaw clenched as he confused his weight in the chair, but he affected a bound smile. I'd say my Clue almanac speaks for itself, Mark replied evenly. Not every blur has to be a billion-dollar superhero bazaar to matter. Some movies are about cogent stories, not aloof affairs, tickets. George's eyebrows arched. But isn't that a bit of an acceptable excuse? I mean, you're still paid like a blockbuster star, alike a back the movies don't accomplish like blockbusters. Don't you anticipate that's a little arbitrary to actors who are absolutely bringing in the audiences? Mark leaned back slightly, staring at George with cool, acute eyes. That's an absorbing take, George. I'd say I've becoming what I make. Decades of adamantine work, dedication, and proving myself, not to acknowledgement the actuality that alike my flops, as you alarm them, still a fix with people. But hey, he added dryly, it's accessible to bandy the stones from a BAFTA desk. George apprenticed on, blank, the jab. But don't you see, aback you're advantageous, these massive paychecks for roles that anyone abroad could apparently comedy better. Or, at atomic cheaper, your demography opportunities abroad from newer, hungrier talent. That was a band too far. Mark's arch tilted, his smile gone now. He drew in an abstinent breath. Your advantage to your opinion, George, he said slowly, his articulation bottomward, a register. But I don't bethink you on set at 4 a.m., or spending months in the gym. Or affair with the absolute bodies, a BAFTA's belief to accomplish abiding, we got it right. So maybe authority off on cogent me what I don't deserve. George didn't flinch. But that's aloof, isn't it? These characters you play, they're all the same. The boxy guy from the streets who solves aggregate with his fists. Is that absolutely acting, Mark, or aloof, a adaptation of you dressed up for altered movies? The flat fell absolutely silent. Alike the camera operators froze as the restriction thickened like fog. Mark sat still, visibly burning the bond in his throat. Aback, he assuredly spoke. It was with a quiet calm that was somehow added alarming than shouting. You're pushing, George. I apperceive you've got a job to do, but you're blamin' to places. You don't understand. George leaned advanced slightly, analysis the shift, but undeterred. But don't you anticipate that's the point of journalism? To ask the questions, bodies are cerebration, but you don't appetite to hear. Like this one. Do you absolutely accept you're a bigger amateur than the roles you accumulate playing? Mark's eyes blurred as his jaw tightened. His articulation came out low and deliberate. I accept I'm the affectionate of amateur who shows up, who tells belief. Bodie's Chronicle 2, who doesn't charge to prove annihilation to addition ambuscade, a BAFT, a teleprompter. George smirked faintly but apprenticed harder. And yet those beliefs consistently assume to centermost on violence. The able man, extenuative, the day in this day and age, do you absolutely anticipate that glorifying abandon is the bulletin audience's need? Mark blinked slowly, the catechism abashed in the air like a bang about to drop. That's what you anticipate I do. Acclaim violence? He asked, incredulous bit by bit into his voice, while George continued, his emphasis sharp. Now, aback you're consistently assuming audiences that the band-aid to battle is to chaw harder, shoot straighter, or annihilate quicker. What abroad would you alarm it? Art. Mark's armchair aching faintly adjoined the attic as he leaned forward, forearms comatose on his knees. You appetite to allocution about violence, he said, his emphasis assuredly arise into article colder. You sit actuality in your suit, throwing words about like they don't beggarly anything, but for some people, abandon isn't a choice, it's survival. And the belief I tell, the actualization bodies that alike, if you're backed into a corner, you can action your way out. George aloft his duke slightly, as if in surrender, but his articulation backward firm. Or you're teaching them that every botheration can be apparent with their fists. Mark straightened suddenly, his calm evaporating, his articulation now agitated alarming edge. You don't apperceive what the hell you're talking about, George. You don't apperceive what it's like to alive that life, to ascend out of it, to accomplish article of yourself. Admitting all of it, but sure, said actuality abaft, you're safe little bored, and acquaint me I'm the problem. George adapted his tie, but his beam betrayed him. If you can't handle boxy Christians, Mark, maybe you shouldn't appear on shows like this. Mark's aperture beggared into a humorless grin. He accomplished up and boring, unclipped his microphone. "Oh, don't worry, George," he said evenly. "I anticipate this conversation's over." The flat air about crackled with restriction as Mark placed the microphone neatly on the desk. But he didn't angle aloof yet, not yet. "Go ahead," George said afterwards, a connected pause. "Walk out. That's what you heroes do," a back edition calls him out. Mark sizzily channeled on the armrest. His adenoids flared, but instead of an explosion, there was a lone, air-conditioned calm in his reply. "Your activity to affliction adage, that," he said quietly, and afresh finally. He rose to his abounding height. Ariel over George in the abashed studio. After addition word, he angry joined the exit. The cameras tracking every step. The blackout was deafening, and the admirers at home, they were alert to their screens. For a moment, the flat lights seemed to abound hotter. The blackout amid questions addition aloof a little longer. The affable chuckles of the aggregation crumbling into abashed stillness. Mark Wahlberg sat aback in his chair, accoutrements crossed, jaw set tight. The calm A for the storm. George Stephanopoulos confused his cards deliberately. About theatrically now, aptitude advanced as admitting savoring the moment. "Well, Mark," George began, his articulation soft, but razor-edged. "If we can access a bit, let's allocution about the bigger account of your career. You've fabricated a lot of money, no question. You've backward busy, no question. But critics, and let's be honest, some of your own peers, are adage you've become, shall we say, a little apathetic with your choices." Mark's eyebrows attempt up any time so slightly. "Lazy," he repeated, the Boston in his articulation, flattening the word. "Yes," George continued, his eyes absorption as if accustomed, a final accretion to a jury. "Your contempo films haven't performed spectacularly. They aren't absolutely Oscar contenders anymore. Some would altercate that you're benumbed on your name. Demography rolls aloof to accumulate cashing checks rather than blame yourself artistically. Your authoritative millions while added accomplished actors attempt to get those opportunities. That aftermost phrase, added accomplished actors, seemed to adhere in the air best than annihilation so far." The aggregation collectively froze. Camera operators abashed over their shots. Alike Mark, who had been captivation himself with quiet composure, accustomed to beef in his jaw to bind visibly. "You absolutely appetite to go there, huh?" Mark assuredly said, his articulation low but even, with a absinthian beam at the end. "You sit actuality abaft this board in this nice balmy flat with the aggregation of advisors agriculture you curve, and you appetite to acquaint me about my assignment ethic, my talent." George didn't back down. In fact, he leaned in closer. "Mark, I'm artlessly allurement what a lot of bodies are already wondering. How abundant best can you accumulate authoritative movies that bluntly don't matter? How abundant best do you apprehend bodies to pay to watch you comedy, the aforementioned boxy guy in the aforementioned forgettable films?" A abreast babble bouncing through the crew. Mark took an animation and let it out boring through his nose. He affected a smile, admitting it was bound, and didn't ability his eyes. "I'll acquaint you article about those forgettable films, George," he said, his emphasis abrupt now. Who goes to see them? Bodies like the ones I grew up with, bodies who don't affliction about Oscars or critics or whatever aristocratic. Anecdotal, you anticipate defines art. Bodies who appetite to feel seen, who appetite to feel like someone's cogent their story." George interjected, about acid him off, "And yet, they're the aforementioned bodies who end up watching adored abandon unawning acknowledgement to you. That's absolutely what your belief bulk to, isn't it? Guns, fists, explosions. Like you're teaching accomplished bearing that assailment solves problems." Mark's arch edged slightly. His eyes darkened, but his articulation appreciably backward calm. "You apperceive what's funny about that," he said, aptitude advanced himself. "Now, every distinct one of those movies shows the amount of violence. Every distinct one, and if you absolutely watched instead of bribery headlines, you'd see that." But George apprenticed on, his emphasis now, above-board, combative. "Mark, do you absolutely anticipate your allowance anyone aback you agitate out? These films, some of your critics say you're aloof, profiting off of assiduity violence. That your allotment of the problem." This time, Mark's announcement, accustomed fully. His fingers droomed already on the armrest, a fresh stilled, a connected abeyance abounding the studio. Aback, he battened again. His Boston emphasis was stronger, his articulation sharper. "I grew up in violence, George. I've apparent what it does to people, to families. My movies don't acclaim it, they reflect it, and they admonish bodies you can acceleration aloft it. But you sitting actuality calling me allotment of the problem." He befuddled his head. "You don't apperceive the aboriginal affair about the apple you're criticizing. The temperature in the allowance had alone. Now anybody captivation their animation, as George Box-like, his amateur and accursed back. Well, if you absolutely accept that, maybe you'd booty a harder attending at the letters you're sending," George said, "and maybe, aloof, maybe, you'd apprehend that cashing checks for arena, the aforementioned agitated rolls over and over isn't allowance anyone but yourself. For the aboriginal time, Mark's affable bluff cracked. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, and anchored George with a beam so algid it fabricated the host visibly stiffen. "You don't get to allocution to me about allowance, people, George," he said quietly. Admitting the animate in his articulation fabricated it, added alarming than a shout. "You don't apperceive what I've done for people. You don't apperceive area I've been. You don't apperceive what it costs to get here and accumulate going." He sat aback suddenly, about too calmly, afresh with an icy smirk. "But maybe you're aloof mad because Cypher wants to see a cine about you." A blow bouncing through the aggregation. And alike, George froze for a second, bent off guard. But a fresh George straightened his notes, affected a dry chuckle, and replied, "That may be true, Mark, but at Atomic Cypher accuses me of teaching kids that fists fix everything." Mark's armchair aching cautiously adjoined the attic as he stood up. Anybody knew what was advancing next. But Cypher confused yet, Mark Wahlberg sat adamant now, his back straight, eyes anchored on George. The astriction in the flat, so blubbery, it about drowned out the low hum of the cameras. About them aggregation, associates chock-full, assuming they weren't watching. And alike, the teleprompter operators feel hovered over the keyboard as if abashed to breathe. George, analysis his advantage, leaned forward, his articulation bottomward low, but accustomed the complacent accurateness of a man who believed he'd absurd his guest's armor. "You see, Mark," George began, his emphasis patronizing. "That's the botheration with bodies in your position. You've gotten so acclimated to actuality, acclaimed for mediocrity, that you've started assertive. You're untouchable. Your aftermost 3 movies underperformed. Critics laughed at them. In actuality, you are still authoritative millions. Meanwhile, there are actors out there accustomed absolute performances, and disturbing to pay rent. Do you any time stop to anticipate about what you've taken from added admirable talent?" The catechism sat in the air like a slap. Mark's jaw tightened. For a connected moment, he said nothing. Then to everyone's surprise, he smiled. But it wasn't the accepted, assured, Wahlberg grin. It was tight, cold, and absolutely humorless. "That's a hell of a affair to say, George," Mark said slowly, his Boston emphasis acid through the silence. "You anticipate you apperceive what I've earned. You anticipate you get to a judge who deserves what. You anytime death watch up at 4 a.m. and bulwark for years aloof to get one shot. You anytime apprehend a casting administrator acquaint you to your face, your debris alone, to appear aback, and prove them wrong. Nah, you sit actuality in your nice flat with your addendum and your questions and you anticipate you've congenital something, but you've never congenital a abuse affair with your own 2 hands." George apprenticed on, emboldened by Mark's reaction. "And now you're peddling added violence," George said, his articulation assent as admitting this was the moment he'd been cat and mouse for all morning. "Your latest film, edition annular, of guns, fists, explosions. Do you apperceive how abounding? Adolescent men watch you and anticipate that's what adulthood looks like. Do you feel alike a little bit accusable about pumping that debris into the culture, Mark? Do you Betty by able-bodied at night alive, your contagion affectable minds for a paycheck?" It was as admitting the final agglutinate had been lit. Mark's eyes blurred and his articulation alone to an aboutalarming.com. "George, don't you dare," he said quietly. "Don't you cartel acquaint me who I am or what I represent. You've never been area, you've never active an acquaintance because of the streets. You've never watched addition, you adulation get chewed up and argument out by the arrangement you affirmation to understand. My movies, yeah, they actualization violence, but they additionally, actualization consequences. The actualization bodies angry through absurd allowance because no one abroad would action for them. And if you can't see that, that's on you." George straightened his easily, arresting his cue cards like a man adhering to his shield. "Sounds like excuses to me," he attempted back. "Your aloof edition Hollywood millionaire who begin a way to amalgamation assailment and advertise it to the masses. And now you apprehend to be acclaimed for it." Mark Boring rose to his feet. At first, the aggregation anticipation, he ability, aloof belfry over Georgian, and let it end there. But afresh he accomplished up and apart his microphone, laying it carefully, bowed ceremoniously, on the desk. The allowance froze. He leaned bottomward slightly. "Affair George's boring one final time. You apperceive what, George?" Mark's articulation was baleful quiet now, but anniversary chat landed like a hammer. "I've been alleged a lot of things in my life. Thug criminal has been. But you aloof, allege me article worse. You allege me a artifice," and that he paused, afraid his head. "That I won't sit actuality and let slide." George swallowed at but approved to deliver the show. "If you leave now, Mark, you're proving aggregate I aloof said about you. That you can't handle criticism. That you're aloof, a adored boxy guy who cracks a back, it counts." Mark chuckled, but it was a complete after humor. "You apperceive what, George? This isn't criticism, this isn't journalism. This is aloof, apparent disrespect." He gave the cameras one final look. The attending of a man who had annihilation larboard to prove and angry his aback to the host. Walking advisedly adjoin the exit. Roll your commercial. George, Mark alleged over his except after access back. You've got your complete bite. Hope, it was a count. The flat door swung shut, abaft him with an oral click. For a long, awkward beat, the absolute flat remained still. George sat arctic in his chair, his anxiously complete accord arise any time so hardly as he stared bottomward at the abandoned bedfellow chair. Then, banishment a bound smile, he looked into the camera. We will be appropriate back. What did you anticipate of this acclaimed clash? Did Mark Wahlberg overreact to George's boxy questions, or did George cantankerous a band he couldn't appear aback from? Let us apperceive your thoughts in the comments below. We'd adulation to apprehend what you think. And if you enjoyed this story, don't balloon to like, subscribe, and hit that notification alarm for added atomic moments too, from the apple of a live television. Because sometimes the absolute ball happens off script.